So thank you all for coming to Mammoths, Mastodons, and more today. My name is Ryan Heron, and I'm the collections curator for the Brown County Historical Society. So I'm up here today to introduce our speakers, which I'll do in a little bit, and then to do the age reveal for our tusk, which I know is why you are all here today. So now you have to wait and listen to me, and that's the last thing I'm going to do. So I'll just give you some background on the tusk and the other remains that we have from the Ice Age, and talk about why we held this event today. So we first learned of the tusk back in October of 2020 after it was discovered by Dalton Desmarais in a gravel pit here in New Ulm. The gravel pit is owned by MR Paving and Excavating and is located in northwest New Ulm. Dalton rescued both the tusk and the partial pelvis of a Columbian mammoth that we have on display in the museum over there. He rescued it from a rock crusher. Had he not noticed them, the remains might have been destroyed and we wouldn't be aware of them at all. Word then spread about the remains, and on Saturday, October 24th of 2020, Alexander Hastings came down to examine them. He is a paleontologist with the Science Museum, and I'll do a full introduction later. So he came down to examine them and then to take them back to the Science Museum for conservation. Paleontology lab manager Nicole Dizanowski over here will be speaking about that process in a little bit. The process lasted for about a year and a half, and then on November 12th of last year, the remains returned home to the museum and were donated to the Brown County Historical Society by MR Paving and Excavating. We then began working on making a new display case for the tusk and the pelvis. We worked with the Science Museum of Minnesota, who created stands for the items, for the remains. And then the case was created by Joe Newbert Welding and Metalwork in North Mankato. While the case was being made, we received another donation of an elephanted bone. This one was a partial American mastodon pelvis, which is also in the display case over there. It's almost an exact duplicate of the one from the Columbian mammoth. It's actually really interesting. So that pelvis was found by Walter Bauer in 1987 in the same gravel pit in northwest New Ulm. He rescued it again from a machine, probably a rock crusher, and then brought it home. And in this past June, his wife Joyce, sorry, I feel bad, Joyce. Joyce Dower donated it to the museum along with a couple other fossils. Fortunately, we were able to fit that pelvis in the same case as the others so that they could all be displayed together. So then a few months ago, we also began the process of having the tusk radiocarbon dated. And fortunately, Nicole was able to provide us with some loose pieces of the tusk that could be used for the dating process. She removed them before the conservation process that she'll talk about in a few minutes. So radiocarbon dating, if you don't know, it works by measuring the amount of carbon-14 that is in organic material. And then the age of that material is calculated based on the amount of carbon-14. Essentially, you determine how many half-lives remain of it, if you remember your chemistry classes, since the organic material was formed. So we worked with Direct AMS in Washington State to carry out the test and received the results about a month ago. So then, in anticipation of the event today, we held a guessing competition, and so now I'll reveal the age of the tusk and announce the winner of the competition. Since the winner is not here, or this winner is here today, then I will hand over the prize. I don't do drum roll sounds, so if anybody wants to do that for me, thank you. So the tusk is 22,136 years old. So Becky Grusendorf is the winner. She guessed 22,000 years. And it was actually real close. There was someone who had guessed a little over 21,000. So great job, Becky. So here is your prize. If you want, you can come claim it afterwards. Yes.
Say that number
Yes.
again.
22,136. So there's also a margin of error with this kind of testing. So there is a 95% chance that the tusk is between 21,966 and 22,306 years old. For our purposes, it's just going to be 22,000. So I was told that there's some individuals who didn't want to stay for the full lecture, so I'm just going to give you a couple minutes, and then I'll introduce our speakers for the program today. Okay, so now I will introduce our speakers for the program today. Today we'll be learning a little about the conservation process for the tusk, and then some information about the animals that lived in Minnesota during the last ice age. So they are Nicole Dizanowski, paleontology lab manager for the Science Museum of Minnesota. So she is the one who worked on the tusk conservation, so she'll be starting here today. And then next is Dr. Alexander Hastings, who is the Fitzpatrick Chair of Paleontology for the Science Museum of Minnesota.
Hi. I am Nicole, the paleontology lab manager at the Science Museum of Minnesota. So, let's see if I can figure out how to make this work. All right, here we go. Okay, so like it was mentioned, this tusk was found along with the bit of the pelvis in 2020. It was found, and we were contacted very, very quickly, which is wonderful, and sort of asked what we should do about preserving the tusk. And the one thing that we requested is please keep it wet. It was found very far underground, and it was found under the water table, so it had lived its entire life, its 22,000 years, basically underwater. They did a phenomenal job of building a structure for the tusk. They padded it wonderfully. It came to us completely in one piece, but then also was covered with shirts that were wet, which was wonderful. It worked wonderfully. And this is what it looked like whenever we received the tusk, and the bit of the pelvis up at the top there. Okay, and these are the same pictures with some close-ups, just to give you an idea. So that's the broken end of the tusk that you would have seen in the museum. Okay, so generally speaking, tusks, they provide us with a unique problem. So we had a box of the exploded tusks at the table there, if you guys got the opportunity to check it out. And the reason that they are difficult to conserve, difficult to preserve, and why they have a tendency to explode, in part has to do with how they're grown. So tusks, they're essentially a cone-in-cone structure. So the very tip of the tusk is the juvenile portion. That's the only part that has enamel on it, the same stuff that our teeth has. And then they continue to add materials as they get older. So they continue to sort of like add a cone of dentine, the same stuff we have in our teeth, and push that juvenile tip outward. And then, of course, like even those separate layers of growth have growth layers within them. So tusks have a huge number of layers, and they tend to not be preserved the same way that we see dinosaur fossils being preserved. They're not heavily mineralized. So even though the tusk is a tooth, and enamel is the hardest part of the body, the hardest mineral, most of their tooth is not actually enamel, or most of the tusk is not actually enamel. It's all mostly dentine and cementum, so the softer parts of our teeth. And that's actually the dentine is what makes up the ivory. So they, growth in life and in death, they give us problems. So, oh, I took a picture of it. I forgot I did that. So that is typically what happens to tusks whenever they are trying to be preserved once they get out of the ground. And the biggest issue is they start to dry. And when they dry, each of those individual layers dry at a different rate. And then, as we know, when things get wet, they have a tendency to swell. And whenever they dry out, they have a tendency to shrink. So all of those layers are shrinking at different rates. which essentially causes like delamination, cracking, or exploding into dust sometimes. So one of the things when looking at ways to conserve wet material, typically that's usually only done with it's only studied in anthropology typically. And there are varieties of methods, but there's no general consensus on the method, and figuring out which method to use actually is based off of the level of preservation, whether it's poor preservation, greatly preserved, and the level of degradation, and you don't typically know those things until it starts to fall apart. So I did not want to have to wait until it started to fall apart to determine whether or not there was degradation that had happened, or if it was poorly preserved. So I decided to combine a couple of the different methods to see if I could keep it from exploding, I guess. Keep it moist. Basically, the biggest issue is it tends to delaminate, or it tends to break apart when it dries. So drying is the biggest issue. All of these methods require a slow dry. Some of them require a slow dry in something like a fridge or a freezer, which the tusk is about 4.5 feet long. It's not super easy to find a freezer or a fridge that's that big. Ours, we do have them, but they're completely full of dead animals right now, so as one does. And then, of course, there are some options for burying it underground again in sand, in which case you would need a big enough space to do that. And so I combined those methods, and what I decided to do was to try and keep it wet the entire time I was preserving it, in hopes that I could eventually use some alcohol, which would help slow it down with drying. We'll see how it goes. Well, we know how it went wonderfully. So the biggest issue was finding a structure that could contain the large tusk. So I contacted our exhibits manager, and he went and bought a trough, a feeding trough, basically. So we got a feeding trough, we lined that trough with a waterproof liner, and then we used expanding foam to sort of take up the shape of the tusk, the sort of extra space. Since I was going to be submerging it in a liquid, I just wanted to sort of minimize the amount of liquid that was necessary. So I used expanding foam and sand, lined it again with another waterproof liner, and then put the tusk in there. And like I said, the t-shirts were wonderful. So when I put the tusk in there, waiting for the solutions, I covered it again with the wet t-shirts. So. Yes, and so the tusk required between 8 and 9 gallons of solution. So I decided to go with a wet dry method, so I was going to try to slowly dry it while it stayed moist, which I know sounds a little counterintuitive. But so first things first, I wanted to consolidate it. I wanted to make sure that it didn't break apart, that it didn't lose any material when I was preserving it. So I decided to use a water-based adhesive. The glues or the adhesives that we tend to use in paleontology react really strangely with water. They do not like water. We typically don't use water-based things. But I went and grabbed some Acrosol WS24, which is it's an acrylic. It is dissolved, it dissolves in water, it goes into solution in water. And that's whatever I used to conserve the tusk. So the Acrosol, it's an acrylic dispersion. It's very accessible. You could get it at sort of any conservation store. And it's fairly cheap, and it has good solubility in water, and fairly neutral pH, and it has a small particle size. So the first thing is that if I was going to try and create a new method, I wanted it to be something that could be done in every sort of paleo lab or every lab space. I wanted it to be cheap. I wanted it to be accessible, which is why we went with the trough and the waterproof liner, and then these water-based adhesives. So, fully submerged the tusk in a solution of our water-based adhesive in 90% water, and after a month, I checked the tusk, I took out the solution, I remixed a new solution with more Acrosol to water, so I increased the Acrosol or the adhesive ratio to the water each month. Those are supposed to be finger crossed emojis. So as I did that, the hope was, so the Acrosol to water, I did more of the adhesive to water initially, hoping that the water would sort of thin it out enough to force it through the tusk. Tusks are very, very dense. Teeth are very dense. And then as I increased the adhesive to water ratio, my hope was that the inner parts of the tusk had already been consolidated with the thinner adhesive, and the thicker adhesives then would sort of conserve it outward. So I mixed each of those up in giant containers like you saw. Each month I changed it out. I occasionally changed the waterproof liner out if it was necessary, but otherwise I didn't do too much with it. I just let it sit there happily. Without covering it completely too, because we found out that when you cover it completely and keep it airtight, it smells so bad. Oh. It smelled rotten, so yeah. And so this is what it looks like in the Acrosol. So you can see it's about the same color too as whenever it came to us. But no, I did not turn it over at all. The sand that we put in there like had conformed to it really nicely. I'm answering mid-thing, sorry. The sand conformed really nicely, so it almost was like it was just like a custom little bath. It reminded me a lot of like taking a wonderful bath with like a bath bomb, so that's kind of what it looked like. But that's what the tusk looked like as I was conserving it in the Acrosol. And the higher levels of the adhesive that I would get, it started coming out this weird black color, which really panicked me for just a moment. I thought that maybe there was some sort of chemical reaction happening. I think it was just the sediment. Because then it looked like that. Okay, so the next process. Once I did about 5 months of adhesive and water, I then moved on to a dewatering process. So the idea is that I would use alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, because again, it was highly available, it's fairly cheap. And that isopropyl alcohol, the hope is that it would go into the tusk and then sort of replace any of the water that was still in the tusk. So this was the dewatering process. I started with a small percentage of alcohol to water, increased it monthly until I ended up with a 100% isopropyl alcohol bath, in which case I allowed it to, at that point, just dry naturally. And I was hoping that the dewatering had gotten most of the water out of the tusk, and that slow dry of the alcohol would be slow enough to finish the drying process without it falling apart. So it started to lighten a bit with the alcohol, which was wonderful. And that slow dry process took about 2.5 months. And then once it was done, that is what the tusk looked like. So after about a 1.5-year process, with the final bath taking about 2.5 months, the tusk came out intact. Each month, whenever I changed the solution, I would check to see if any bits had broken off. That did not happen, which was wonderful. And then I think the most impressive part is that, so the first picture there is one of the first pictures that you guys saw. That's what the tusk looked like whenever we received it. And this is what it looked like after the entire bath process. So there was basically no movement. And some bits had been, there was a portion here that had come off. And I was conserving that in its own container, separate, to just see how smaller bits reacted. And it went back on with no gaps, which is insane, because again, the thing that happens with tusks is they tend to expand, shrink, swell, all these weird things, and crack apart. And the fact that they went back together without any gaps means that there was basically no movement that happened during the entire conservation process, which hopefully is good news for all tusks out there. Yeah. And there you have it. That's it. The final picture of the tusk in its nice little sand box, and being conserved with the weird glues that we use that don't act great with water, and it did act wonderful. And yeah, so. Yeah, do you guys, any questions?
Did you have to preserve the hip bones that are there also?
Yes, one of them. So the pelvis portion that was on the left of the tusk, that was conserved. Bone doesn't act as strange as tusk. So it doesn't grow in the same way. You don't have the same layers. Plus, it is hydroxyapatite versus that softer sort of dentine, and it did not need a lot of work. That was mostly just using the typical consolidants that we use in the lab, the ones that act funny in water. So it's just plastics that we dissolve in acetone. But that held up wonderfully.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
people that do what you do, like all over the world, are you kind of in touch and develop this process, or were you just making it up as you go?
Oh gosh, no. A little bit, which is why it took so long. I did initially send a few emails out to other prep lab managers or other like fossil preparators who I know who had worked with tusks. One person actually in Seattle was telling me a story about a tusk that they had gotten that had already started to sort of delaminate and come apart. So their thought was to put zip ties around it to hold it into place, which I've seen people do with like plumber's tape, like the metal or vices and stuff like that. I'm sure we all know water is fantastical. It made the Grand Canyon in 6 million years, and it actually expanded past the zip ties and completely cracked and fractured. So that was a wonderful cautionary tale. So yeah, I contacted, I think, 3 different managers at other institutions, and then I looked through the literature, which was mostly based around archaeological specimens. But then using all of that, that's whenever I kind of came up with a method. And played as I went along, and actually there's another lab right now, the Mammoth site, that has tusks that is currently using the same method, and they're speeding it up to see whether or not it can be done quicker. So, yeah.
So apparently the water-based acrylic adhesive that you used would not crust over on the surface with the high dilution. Did it just kind of absorb into the tusk, and then you would rinse it off and apply your thicker solution?
Yeah, I didn't rinse. I didn't do a ton of like handling of the tusk as it was going through the adhesive baths. Typically, with anything that's really, really porous in the lab, whenever we apply adhesive to it, it sucks it up like a sponge. And as this was dehydrating, it was sucking everything up like a sponge. The adhesives that we were using can leave sort of a crust, but since it's water-based, it is removable with water.
Yeah.
So the water and like the alcohol would have basically done that job, and then I went and applied the plastic-based, the boot var and paraloid or plastic adhesives afterwards. Yeah.
Is it difficult to tell between a mammoth tusk and a mastodon tusk?
If there's a small portion, they're shaped differently. So mastodons tend to be straighter, mammoths tend to be more curved. So if you have the entirety of the tusk, I believe it would be easy to tell, but smaller portions, not so easy. But fun fact, if you look at a cross section, you can tell a mammoth from elephant based on the shape of the structures in the minerals. So, which is really cool.
So you might get into this, but is there a way to extrapolate the size of the mammoth from that?
That I'm not good at. That's more of an Alex question. Yeah.
We'll talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Anything else? Well, thank you.
Okay. It's just. Oh yeah, probably need that too, right? Okay. Yeah. Okay. While Ryan's switching over, I can try and address the size of the mammoth. The short answer is not a great way to give you any real quantifications around that. I can say it's not a small one by any means. You're looking at kind of pretty comparable big adult size for these mammoths. There's a little debate on how diagnostic they are between. There's 2 Columbian and woolly mammoths. I'm leaning much more heavily towards Columbian mammoth based on kind of the shape and a little bit of the curvature that's happening there. Shows up a lot more in Columbian mammoths than in woolly mammoths. But that's a very non-quantitative answer to your quantitative question, sorry. So yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about the awesome Ice Age beasts of Minnesota and the cool stuff that we have in our wonderful state here. So a lot of the times when we think of the Ice Age, we often just think of this kind of barren landscape full of just ice, and that's literally it. But this is really just where the glaciers were, and that shifted a heck of a lot of times over thousands and thousands of years, going back and forth and back and forth. So there were times where the ice did come down all the way to like parts of Kansas even, but then there were parts of the ice ages in which it was much further north than that. So Minnesota does have a fun history around kind of the margins shifting quite a bit over time. This is a great, this is actually a much oversimplified version But essentially, we're here in Minnesota here, and there's lots of different ages at which time, virtually all of the state is covered. There are times where we actually kind of spared part of southeastern Minnesota in tying into what's known as the driftless area, which is mostly central Wisconsin. And most of what we're typically talking about when we're talking about the ice ages is the most recent one, known as the Wisconsin phase. And it was a really nice time. This is kind of a similar scenario to what you would have seen even fairly close to those glaciers in what's called the Pleistocene epoch, or the time of the ice ages, right? So there's actually lots of amazing plant growth happening, some very familiar animals, some kind of fantastic creatures like mastodons, things like caribou would have been coming much further south, and a lot of other things we typically think of as very northern things would have actually been hanging around in our neck of the woods. So there's a really vibrant ecosystem that's really fun to explore and is actually pretty well preserved in a very thick Pleistocene gravel deposit right here in New Ulm. So Ryan was talking about setting up a bit of the kind of glaciation, and I realized I don't have good maps going far back enough to the age of 22,000 of the mammoth here. So it's kind of interesting because you're looking at about 25,000. Let's see if I can skip quickly back. Oh, no, we're going forward. Darn it. What am I doing? No, this is spoilers. Jeez. Okay. Here we go. So going back to this map here. So 22,000, the maximum is actually about 25,000 for when we're getting out to here. So that means that over that time we're kind of receding back here, but it's interesting because there's actually this big chunk of ice that was sitting here for a very large part of around that time that actually is right up on top of, here's Brown County, completely underneath the ice. Now that line did shift a bit over time, so even though this is actually a younger time of 15,500, that ice was actually basically right about where we are now. So that means that this mammoth was hanging out very close to the edge of that glacier, which is actually really fascinating, kind of fun. So a little bit after that, we start to see some of that ice receding in the southern part of our state here. Keeps pulling on back, and by the time you get to about just over 14,000, you're finally ice-free here in Brown County, and you continue to be ice-free for the rest of time until now. The ice, the main part of the glacier here is going to keep receding backwards. We're getting some of these really fun ancient glacial lakes that were much larger than the lakes that we have in these part of the states today. You start to also develop what will become this massive thing called Glacial Lake Agassiz, which ends up occupying pretty much a large chunk of the northwestern part of Minnesota here. If you're not familiar with Glacial Lake Agassiz, it's actually larger than any lake that we have today, coming out at 170,000 square miles, covering a massive area, which does include Minnesota, a large part of that. So this is actually one of the reasons that's really affected the coming off of the Ice Age record for northwestern Minnesota, and why we don't tend to get nearly as much up in there, because it was a big old lake instead. And then coming in at 12,000, which is largely kind of regarded as pretty close to the end of the Ice Age, you've got just a few remains of these big glacial lakes, and Minnesota's more or less glacier-free by then. And that enters into a whole other time. Now, during all that time, there were fun creatures crawling around Minnesota here, just for funsies here. So we've got the 4 possible elephant-like relatives around here. Does anyone want to guess which one this is? You can give a general name. Anyone want to throw out a guess? It's a mastodon. Yeah, that's the mastodon. So they have kind of this more even back here. They don't have that kind of big haunch going down to lower shoulders here. If you had to guess, which one would you call that one? It's a woolly mammoth. Y'all are great at this. Good. This one's going to get a little trickier, though. What do you think about this one? I said it, but it's not a common name so much. So this is, I went ahead of myself. So this is a Columbian mammoth, and then actually this is one that I did not mention. This is the much lesser known Jefferson's mammoth. There's a debate on whether or not that's even a valid different species or not. But basically, there's some that don't really fit in the category of either woolly or Columbian all that well, so they created a third category of the Jefferson's mammoth. Now, all of these have been at least put out there as possible things that we have right here in Minnesota. But there's a little bit of a contention still around whether or not it's 2 or 3 species. So mastodons, we do have a good mastodon record. It's not nearly as much as mammoths. So of course we got this nice chunk of pelvis now here at the Brown County Historical Society, but this is from a museum in Olmsted over by Olmsted County Museum in Rochester. These are mostly found in the southern part of the state, although there is one record from much further north. So you'll see a bunch of these kind of dots on the Minnesota map here to give you a bit of sense of where they've been found so far. Apologize, those dots are about to get real tiny, so I'll kind of give you some generalities here. So mammoths in general are mostly found in the southern part of the state, so a lot of them have been found over on kind of the southeastern part, but there are some records that go much further north. So this is actually one of our best Ice Age records is actually from mammoths. A lot of those records are from teeth. They are big honking things. This is actually the same one that we had out on the table. Tusks do, at least pieces of them do show up from time to time. And this is one that I'm really excited to be adding to our record here. So there actually is no published record whatsoever of Ice Age horses in Minnesota, despite having been found in lots of other states here in the United States as well as in Canada. It's because we don't actually have any in collections until fairly recently when a person who is right here in this room here, William Eibner, who's an amateur collector here, if you haven't met him, he's a great guy, has actually added, I believe now 3 potential Ice Age fossil horses, actually giving us a confirmed record. The only way to actually really confirm those is we're going to have to get them carbon dated to make sure that they are not actually just more recent horses that happen to look more fossilized. So keep an eye out for this, but this might even be news that you get to hear before it's even actually out there. Oh, sorry. Yes, of course, this is a tooth, I should say. So this is a lovely cheek tooth or molar. Actually, the other teeth that William found as well were also molar teeth, so they're really, really distinct. They're can't be confused with any other type of animal. They're really just horses. Problem is Ice Age horses and modern horses actually have very similar teeth. So that just kind of looking at it, you're not necessarily going to know. So we're actually going to have to go to carbon dating to really know for sure that it does come from the Ice Age. These are from New Ulm, Minnesota. Yeah. You've got a great place here. This one is not from New Ulm, Minnesota, but there have been a handful of these around. These are one of my favorite Ice Age creatures because they're really cool and they're actually still alive today. This is a skull of a muskox. We've actually gotten a handful of these now from our state. These are, if you haven't run into a muskox, they are so cool. They're these big woolly things with these big helmeted skulls that have these horns coming off of them, and they were roaming around here in Minnesota during the last Ice Age. And you might have seen, this is the one and only giant sloth fossil that we actually have from Minnesota. So we actually brought this out today, so you might have seen it out on the table. These are awesome, huge, hairy beasts that had big claws. This would have actually been covered in keratin, so that whole thing would come out over to here. And they are just so cool. They're found in lots of other parts of North America. It's kind of odd that we only actually have one, so I'm really hopeful that we'll find some more. But this is one known as Megalonyx jeffersoni. And, this one here. So this is a fun story. So if you're not familiar with this particular ROUS, if you're a Princess Bride fan, is a giant beaver. So we got a modern relative right here. So this is kind of beaver that we might still see here in Minnesota today. And this was also here in Minnesota. So this is the giant beaver. It came in at about 200 pounds, which puts it on the size of a black bear. Actually getting 7-8 feet long, including the tail. Really impressive incisors. So we've got the giant beaver on the right, we've got a modern beaver here. So you're seeing those massive, massive incisors, just absolutely impressive. We actually have 2 very nice skeletons of giant beavers from Minnesota, actually one from St. Paul and one from Minneapolis. But they're basically ranging throughout the southern part of the state. They actually pulled one out of a well they were digging in Fairborn County. I'm still really, really hopeful that we'll pull one specifically from New Ulm as well. What's that?
Freeborn County?
Sorry, yes, Freeborn, thank you. Yeah, thereabouts. And the other great place where you can find Ice Age fossils is getting underground into the caves. So Tyson Spring Cave is in kind of by the Rochester area-ish. I've been there a few times now. That's actually a privately held cave, as actually weirdly a lot of caves are in Minnesota. And you go to this random field. It's just a modern farmer's field where they're like, get into there. You're like, okay. You go down this incredibly dark shaft to, well inside the earth. It's about a 120-foot ladder that they actually rigged into this well casing here. And at the bottom, you start sloshing around. It's a flooded cave, so it tends to be about knee height for most of it. This is a video which shows you exactly what it's like in a cave because it's really incredibly dark and you see almost nothing. Oh, you're even getting some of the audio here. So you're sloshing around with your headlamp and you are looking under the water to try and find things that are coming out. And every now and then you start to actually find stuff. So you can actually pull bones. Some of these are, so it's basically an underground river. So it's kind of going through a gravel deposit, picking some stuff up and dropping it off in the cave. Unfortunately, it is doing that with recent stuff as well. So like we found modern sheep bones in there alongside some very ancient things that are not recent at all, including the scimitar-toothed cat and the extinct stag moose. So both of these have been found in this cave here in southeastern Minnesota, including this amazing beast. So this is a little bit similar to the saber-toothed cat. You might be familiar with Smilodon. It's actually a different type of big cat. It actually is even a little bit bigger than a lot of the saber-toothed cats were. So really big on the front end, really powerful, maybe lesser known predator, but did have its home here in Minnesota. And it might have even been hunting after the really impressive stag moose. This is a kind of cousin to the modern moose that we have in Minnesota, with an even bigger and somehow even more impressive rack of antlers. So both of these remains were pulled out of that cave alongside some other kinds of things that might not be quite so exotic, but were also around during the last ice age, like deer and owls and foxes and things like that. All of that helps paint a bigger picture. Now, as we kind of push past the Ice Age and into more recent times, this is what we call the Holocene epoch, and that is when you start seeing a heck of a lot less of these. Actually, the mammoths really die off at the end of the Ice Age, and these start to just explode across the entire state. So this is one of many beautiful bison skulls that have been pulled out across the state of Minnesota. Bison really start to just absolutely dominate, and now you can find them almost across the entire state. Their teeth preserved pretty well. This is a skull that was found by a local resident in the town of Wyoming, Minnesota. So this is, it had been, unfortunately, he had found it, he thought it was a cow skull, and just kind of set it on the bank. And it wasn't until a year later that he told us about it, so it's why it's looking maybe not quite so fresh. But we're still glad to have it. There's still a good record for this. And once we found that out, got in the water there. So this is one of those where like the water's only about like hip deep. You're like, oh, I could wear chest waders. Problem is, you got to bend over, right? What happens if you're wearing chest waders? Then you're no longer at any point in wearing waders anymore. So I just got a thick wetsuit on and some coveralls over that. Visibility was, I'm telling you, it was zero. It was zero. You could put your hand, an inch under the water and not see your hand. Like, it was nothing at all. So I never had to do paleontology by touch before, but that was just a fun little exploration there. So you're rooting around down there and like, oh my gosh, there's a bison bone. So that's a nice scapula pulled out of there. Over really just the course of a day, I was able to noodle these things out of the mud, and we got a lot of bones here. Including not only from what seemed to be that same adult that gave the skull that we knew was there, found there already, but also we found some juvenile bones there too. So we had a couple of those out on the table. You might have seen those. So we were able to actually find remains of 2 different adults plus a juvenile, and we're hoping to get back out there and see if we can't pull out some more, because this was, not even a full day's work in order to get that stuff out there, which is absolutely incredible. So Minnesota is just chock full of ancient bones, and I love it. So we are constantly expanding that record. We are going out and finding new stuff. One of our big areas for fieldwork is right here in New Ulm. So that is largely because you got that great Ice Age gravel deposit that is yielding all kinds of fun stuff. So we'll go along the Cottonwood River in particular. We've been going, especially under permit, to Flanders State Park and finding lots of cool stuff. So all of that is improving our fossil record here in Minnesota. Fortunately, we're also, didn't have any slides about it, but you can also find fossil leaves from the time of the dinosaurs, coincidentally in some of these same spots on the river. So you get this wonderful 2-for-1 coming for two wildly different geologic ages, different kinds of things, but both really helpful in improving our awesome record here in Minnesota.
The water's pretty low right now.
And when the water's low, that's real. I know that's not great for everybody, but for us, it's actually really nice because it really helps us get a lot more access to all what's going on there, exposes a lot more, and it just gives us a good chance. I will say it is really helpful when there's a big rain event because that does tend to flush up, kind of bring up new stuff to the surface, which is really helpful. So I wanted to finish with this other project here, which has been years in the works and is still going. So I'm going to start this, though, with the question to the audience: what is the state fossil of Minnesota?
There is none.
Boom! Exactly, yes. So there is no state fossil here in Minnesota, which is, it's not my favorite thing about our state, but we're working to fix that. So there are just 5 states in these United States that do not have any type of state fossil as their symbol. And we are in that very short list. So when I got started at the Science Museum in 2018, I realized this surprising fact and decided to start to do something about it. Things came together and it was finally like 2020. We're going to do this awesome thing. We go across the state. We go to all the schools. We talk to people, shake hands. And what do you think happened in 2020? That might have ruined all of those plans. Yeah, so we had to pivot pretty hard on that one. We ended up doing what was mostly a virtual campaign. So I didn't want to just pick my favorite fossil in Minnesota. I wanted to put out a lot of options. I wanted to capture the voice of Minnesota as best we could. So we put together a list of what ended up being 9 different candidates of awesome, cool things you can find right here in Minnesota. We've talked about a bunch of them already. And basically had this online vote. So we encourage people to go on and make their choice and make their voice known. And through this, we also packaged this for schools specifically and created this online lesson that teachers could do with their class that not only went over all the different kinds of fossils they can find in Minnesota and the different candidates, but also just like how bills get passed. So there's a bit of a civics lesson in how you would actually approve and get a state fossil made as the official state symbol. So we had all this, went out to schools as well, got thousands of votes, and we also did a bunch of local press. We're going on local TV stations. We got the local newspapers involved. I was really happy. I'm gonna let you all know, my absolute favorite pick was, we have a big crocodile that was found in the northern part of Minnesota. It was my absolute favorite. So when the Wasabi Tribune came out for the ancient crocodile, I was like, heck yes, all right. But sadly, my favorite was not the winner in the end. So this was in 2021 now. We had the big vote. And the hands down winner by far was the giant beaver. Has a very clear winner coming in well above the runner-up, the ancient bison. A little bit, to put it mildly, yeah. And I don't want to disparage our fair legislators here. Wouldn't dream of it. So we did, so this was in late 2021. If you don't know, our legislation in the state of Minnesota happens kind of late January, February until May, and that's it, right? So it's just a fairly short session. So that beginning of 2022, did the whole thing, gave testimony and everything about the educational value of state fossils. And how awesome the giant beaver is. That year, for whatever reason, they decided to fold it into this big bill, which had a ton of controversy and a big budget attached to it. And shucks darn it, they didn't manage to actually pass that in the end. So we didn't get a state fossil. Came back at it in 23 this year, at the beginning of the year, and didn't even make it as far as that. So it didn't even make it to committee in the end. So we are a little bit taken aback. We're not giving up, though. We're going to keep on this effort to try and establish a state fossil. So stay tuned. Hoping, by the end of next legislative session, you'll see this big splashy thing with my big grinning face going, yeah, we got a state fossil. So stay tuned for more. So thank you so much for lots of these great sources, great people we've been working with right here in New Ulm, funding from our state, and you for listening. And if you like social media, I'm doing a whole heck of a lot of stuff on there, so follow us along or the lab there. So with that, I will stop talking and say thank you so much. I think we can do some questions here too. Yeah.
So, why did all these Pleistocene species die off? And it seemed like they all died off except for one you mentioned that is still around.
Right, so like bison kind of came in at that time and then just did amazingly afterward. So why did the mammoths die out? Why did the giant beaver die out? Why do, all these cool and amazing things that seemed like they would have been really successful? And you've probably heard a bit of this story before, but climate absolutely had a big factor in that. So you are going through a pretty, what at least up until then would have been considered a very rapid warming period in which you are just changing the quantities and the locations of all the plants that make up the backbone of the ecosystem, and then that just scales on up. So especially when you're something that has very high energy demands, needs a very large range and a lot of food availability like the mammoths, that starts bringing down your population sizes to the point that they're no longer sustainable and they end up dying out. And that's going to be true for a lot of the other kind of larger versions of smaller things that we still have alive today. Now, that's not going to be the case for absolutely everything. So there were actually like white-tailed deer were around during the last ice age, and they're still around today. So it's not like everything died out, but a lot of these kind of big icons of the ice age were kind of, their population was weakened enough that it wasn't able to kind of maintain those numbers and the genetic diversity, and then ultimately died out.
Any chance you can get that bill to stand on its own?
Oh, yes, so the state fossil, that's actually what we wanted. We wanted exactly that. We did not want it folded into the larger controversial bill at all. The thing I'll add to is there's no budget with these. Like, there's no money tied to it. It's just signing a piece of paper. We'll keep at it until we finally get a state fossil. So we're not going to give up.
Why can't you just name it?
Well, I can name it, but then nobody's going to listen to me. So we'll work a lot better if the governor says it's a state fossil. I wouldn't be opposed to a giant beaver being. I know there's a lot of ideas out there. I don't think I saw a giant beaver on any of them, but it would be a cool one. Yeah. In the back.
Have you come across any evidence of humans cutting apart any?
Yeah, so there are places where we definitely know humans were processing the remains of mammoths, as well as just a couple of other like human interactions with other ancient creatures. We have not found those in Minnesota specifically, but we do know that humans go back to at least 11 to 12-ish thousand years ago, which is absolutely overlapping with a whole bunch of these things. So they would have been interacting in the same environment as giant beavers and mammoths right here in Minnesota for sure. But we have yet to actually find definite evidence of them doing it specifically in Minnesota. But we know they're doing it in other areas nearby, so they probably were doing it here too. Yeah.
Where's your favorite place in Minnesota today?
My favorite place in Minnesota is New Ulm. What can I say? Let's gotta go with that one. Yeah, no, it's a fantastic place. I absolutely love it. It's a softball right there. I'll say my second favorite place. I also like doing a lot of work up in the Iron Range because you can find sharks and crocodiles from the time of the dinosaurs, which is also very, very cool. But it's also super fun finding Ice Age stuff, and also like leaves from the age of the dinosaurs is pretty amazing here in New Ulm too. Cool. Right.
So, before you retire, you're young, you got a lot of years.
Hopefully that's not soon, yeah.
Will we be able to clone one and have it up running?
So this has been a thing for years and years now, and it seems like every couple of years you see another story where like, oh, we're going to clone a mammoth, and I've been hearing that story for about 15 years now. They've made no progress on that whatsoever. So we do actually have quite a bit of the genome of mammoths. We actually even, just like a year or so ago, they got older mammoth DNA than anyone ever thought they would, over 1 million years old. Nobody thought you could actually do it because there wouldn't be anything left to get. So we do have quite a bit of genetic information. The piece that nobody ever seems to think about is how are we going to actually grow a baby mammoth? So once you get all the DNA, even if you take an elephant, and this is way oversimplifying, but take out its DNA, put in the mammoth DNA, how are you going to actually grow it? And we don't have anything like an artificial womb the size of an elephant. That's not a thing that's been successfully done. They like did it with a goat once, and it didn't go great. It kind of went okay, but then they seem to like not really do that anymore. So that's a massive thing they have to figure out. There's the idea that you could actually take that fertilized egg and put it inside a modern elephant. It might gestate there. But you got to keep in mind, elephants are enormously large animals, and their ovaries are way in there, right? So you got to get a needle and take this little like cell and get it in exactly the right spot without like any way of knowing exactly where you're going with that. So it's a huge challenge in just logistically trying to grow one of these that nobody seems to have actually figured out, or I'm not even sure that they've made much progress on that. So I'll say it's technically. It seems like a thing that could eventually be done. I think it's going to be quite a long time. But I will say, if like my last day on this earth is getting to take my old body and get up onto a mammoth, I can die happy. That will be perfectly fine by me. So maybe by the time I hit my deathbed, hopefully very long from now, I'll get to live that.
This may be a dumb question, but how can you infer the size and texture of the fur on an animal like this?
Yeah, so size and texture fur, so that's very difficult to get. And a lot of that is kind of looking to modern animals living in similar climate environments. And then now there's the much more useful tool, looking to ones that are basically coming out from as frozen remains, essentially. So we now have multiple mammoth remains, as well as cave bear and a woolly rhino that have been found in particularly very far northern areas that were essentially frozen in peat and have been ever since the Ice Age and are just now thawing out. So we actually do have things that have hair still attached to them, and that gives us our best possible glimpse on what these things would have looked like when they're alive. So that's been a much more useful tool. But beyond that, you're then looking towards things that are living in similar situations that are ideally close relatives. All right. Oh, one more. All right. Go for it.
The cat that was, or you found parts of in the Tyson well, what's the relative age of that, and how high would it stand?
Yeah, so that was actually a bit older even than this mammoth. It came in at just under 27,000 years ago for that. That actually, they got a good carbon date for that. And get this, the Homotherium, it's kind of tallest at the shoulders, so the shoulders would be about here, which is kind of terrifying, really, yeah. Really cool. Well, that's a good note to end on. That's terrifying. So thank you so much for coming here today. Thanks to the Science Museum of Minnesota.
As Alex just said, thank you all for coming. So the museum has free admission for the rest of the day, so you are welcome to go back over there and check out our exhibits. I believe the Science Museum staff is going to be leaving shortly. But yeah, maybe you can catch them. Also, we have our holiday displays, so if you didn't make it in last Friday, you can check that out. The Menzel Village is up, and we also have a guest curator, a homemade village created by Pearl Breaker is on display as well, and it shows buildings from New Ulm. So be sure and check that out. Thank you all for coming. And we have lots of cake up here, so please help yourselves. No cake in the museum, though.